Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Wonderful. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Frank Vogel, and I'm with the Partnership for Transparency Fund, which provides knowledge, expertise, advice to NGOs in many developing countries to help them with their anti-corruption programs. And we're very delighted today to be hosting this event with the Center for Global Development. Charles Kenny is here. He's going to moderate our panel today. Charles is the author of a book called Results, Counting the Right Things in Aid and Corruption, which all of you should buy. It's a bestseller, so you will have difficulty getting it, but please go online to CGD and get it. It's a very good book, and it makes Charles a marvelous moderator for a very distinguished panel that we have today. 2 years ago, here in this room, we held a forum, the Partnership for Transparency Fund and CGD. One of the distinguished panelists at the time was Dan Ritchie, who's sitting back there. Another was Robert Mueller, the retired, at the time retired, FBI director. Today, we're honored to have his World Bank equivalent. Pascale Dubois, who is our lead speaker today, is the World Bank's cop. She's shaking her head, but I was told at the forum the other day at the World Bank that people are scared of Pascale. I don't find her very scared. But like Robert Mueller, she has, as a person of extraordinary integrity and great experience, and she brings to her position at the World Bank a level of, let's say, depth of knowledge that is very rare for somebody who has held that position in the past. In other words, she comes from development, she comes from law, she comes from a lot of World Bank experience, and she is now the Vice President for Integrity, an appropriate name, and she will tell you a bit about what that is involved. At the same time, Pascale Dubois is the acting Vice President of Ethics and Business Conduct. In other words, at this moment in time, she is Madam Integrity across the board for the internal staff as well as the external vendors of the bank. Prior to that, Pascale Dubois was the Chief Suspension and Debarment Officer in the bank, which is a bit like today she's heads the investigations, and if you will, the prosecution. Before that, one way of looking at it, she was the judge. What we've asked Pascale to do today is to talk about the global systemic impact of the work that the Integrity Department at the bank does. Why is it that, is the bank just doing it for its own operations, or does it have a much broader basis? Pascale, who has law degrees from her home country of Belgium, as well as NYU, who has held many senior positions, voluntary positions, I believe, for the International Bar Association, the American Bar Association, is wonderfully qualified to look at that global picture. After Pascale has made introductory remarks, our distinguished panel will come up. Charles will lead the discussion, and then it'll be open to Q&A. And with that, Pascale Dubois, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was certainly a very nice introduction. And I always say, if only my family and my dog were as scared as me, like, when I raise my voice at home, right? Then, and definitely you saw me reacting to the word COP, and I will explain how, we're really changing the way that we're doing business at the bank. So I'll just keep that here for a moment so you can sort of start wondering why, this is here. A little bit of background. So because I see some people that I know from other lives. World Bank, for the longest time, did not get involved in corruption. It was considered a political thing. It was not something that we did. World Bank and any other international organization will usually start doing things because, others around the world are doing particular things. So it was no surprise that, you had the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which in America, which started going after US corporations who were paying bribes, to foreign government officials. Once the Americans were doing, they were like, we want a level playing field, we want others to do this. Not surprising, again, you have the OECD, which were, the playmates, from a commercial point of view, with the Americans, who then entered, all the OECD countries entered into the OECD Convention on Bribery, and then later came, the UN Convention Against Corruption. Not surprisingly, I think, when you're looking at, the way that things work and the way that, anti-corruption very much ought to be looked at as well as from a commercial point of view and from a leveling the playing field point of view. If one country tries to have its citizen not pay bribes, other countries, will want to do the same thing because, you don't want to be the only one who's clean, right? So, right around the time that the OECD Convention on Bribery gets signed, World Bank starts to also get involved in the fight against corruption. Everybody who's been at the World Bank knows about the famous speech by then President Jim Wolfensohn, who started speaking about the cancer on corruption. And so this was in 97. One of the founders of TI, Frank Vogel, was instrumental in having that conversation with the World Bank at that time. Wouldn't it be a good idea that, in addition to what is happening at the OECD level, that you use your leverage, right, to also influence, your member countries? And primarily in the beginning, what we were asked to do was, because it was also the US was pushing the World Bank, and what we were asked to do was look at things from a fiduciary point of view, in the sense donors are giving money to the World Bank. You want to make sure that then the World Bank uses that money for what is called, productive purposes. And so we've gone a very, very long way since, these first days where we were on. First, we didn't do anything because it was considered political. And then when the World Bank started looking at anti-corruption and also fraud, collusion, coercion, and obstructive practices, those are the things that can get a company in trouble. It was very much first from a lens from, fiduciary point of view. Make sure the donors would tell us that you're using the money that we entrust to you, productively. Okay. Now, we're a development institution, so we need to make sure that, we fulfill our fiduciary duty. But obviously, given that our twin goals are to eradicate extreme poverty and promote shared prosperity, the reason why we get involved in things such as fighting fraud and corruption is much larger, right? At the end of the day, the only thing that we're really interested in is making sure that when we do a particular project or when a particular grant or loan is given for development policy purposes, that the poor are actually being helped. I mean, I think our purpose is very simple, and so therefore I always like to show photographs because nothing better than a photograph to show why it is that we got involved in the fight against corruption. So, for instance, if there's fraud and corruption. Electrical coils in a particular country. They were supposed to be full copper, but they were painted with copper, and in fact they were not copper, and they would explode. To the right, baby warmer, obviously not a very good baby warmer, right? At the bottom, water pumps, defective water pumps, obviously the water is not going to be pumped. Education, if there's an educational project and the books in fact never arrive, right? These are the reasons, right? Every time that we do a project, we actually want to make sure that, that the way that it was designed, that, is going to work. So at the bank, and that's, to the COP element, right? So to the extent, and it's very normal as well, you see this around the world that, let's look, for instance, at other multinationals, or let's look at bilaterals, right? At countries. You go from nothing, and then usually you start with enforcement. And not surprising and then you go to prevention. And so not surprisingly at the World Bank, the first unit that gets set up are investigators. So the whole focus initially is all on investigations, enforcement. And then later, and as you see this with in the country context as well, once you get people's attention with enforcement, right? So at the World Bank, enforcement means that there is an investigation by the Integrity Vice Presidency, which I had. And then the moment that the investigation is finished, we send it on to the Office of Suspension and Debarment, which functions as an administrative judge of first instance, in the sense that they're the ones that determine on behalf of the World Bank whether there's enough evidence. If there is enough evidence, Office of Suspension and Debarment suspends the company and recommends a sanction. And a sanction is usually a term of debarment, 2 years, 3 years, depending on the fact. And the sanction always contains a remedy and something that is going to focus on prevention. Our baseline sanction is a debarment with conditional release. That means that if a company is debarred for, say, 2 years, before the 2 years are over, the company needs to put in place a compliance program to the satisfaction of the bank. And this, and then let me just finish, our sanction system. So INT investigate, Office of Suspension and Debarment functions as an admin judge of first instance. And then if the company does not like the result, which happens in about 1/3 of all the cases, they can go on to a sanctions board, which consists of 5 judges and their outside judges. So let's talk about compliance and the fact that whether it's for an international organization or for a country, you start very often with deterrence, you start with enforcement. And then once you get people's attention, because if you debar somebody for a number of years and you do this long enough, you get a lot of attention. Then the time is ripe to start doing prevention. So I always like to say that, unless, that if you only do enforcement, right, you're really missing an opportunity because you should also massively do prevention. If you're only doing prevention, quite frankly, you're a little bit naive because nobody's going to pay attention, right? Because there's no stick, right? And so to get this nice balance, right, is something that we're constantly working on to get this good balance between how much enforcement you want and versus prevention. Another thing too is that I need to mention is that at the World Bank there are a lot of so from the days that INT Integrity Vice Presidency started with just like a handful of people to now. You have literally hundreds of people that are working on both governance and anti-corruption. You have the governance global practice, you have the stolen asset recovery. People in procurement obviously have a big role to play. Also, International Finance Corporation and MIGA do due diligence in the projects that they're financing. So I think it's for me, it's particularly nice, having been at the bank now 22 years, that you see a big change in terms of how we're dealing with corruption and prevention. And I find that the system has matured to a great extent. And we're talking about it earlier, that from the days that you couldn't really have an open conversation about what was happening. Because people would get very nervous about it. So first it was denial, then you had a period where people would get very agitated about it. Recently, I've been in several luncheons with regional vice presidents where we discuss the issue of corruption, and I just love the way that we can speak about it now. Right? We can speak about it as we would speak about any other important issues, such as, environment. You can speak about corruption, and people talk about, the levels of corruption in the countries where they're working about. And that, I think, is a good mentality, right? Because if people can openly speak about what is going on, right, and looking at things from a risk perspective, right, as opposed to looking at it from, oh my God, look at, what is going on. So want to mention a little bit to go back, to INT where I work right now, just to give you some numbers in terms of how it was that we got the attention of people. So since '99, the World Bank has sanctioned 895 firms and individuals, which has led to about 300 cross-debarments. So. Here's also an interesting thing. So if you're the strength in numbers, right? If you're a multilateral development bank, not a good idea to be the only one that actually does this, right? You want to make sure that the other multilateral developments do this, right? So several years ago, one of my colleagues at the World Bank, Steve Zimmerman, pushed to have a cross-debarment agreement between all the other multilateral development banks. So that means that if any company or an individual is being debarred, So debarment means not receiving contracts financed by the World Bank, and it's public, right? And there is also a public decision. So if a company gets debarred or an individual gets debarred by any of the multilateral development banks for more than a year, they automatically get cross-debarred by all the other multilateral development banks. Think in terms of impact, what that does, right? If a company receives a lot of business in emerging markets, right? And all of a sudden it gets cross-debarred by all these multilateral development banks. That is the type of thing that is going to take a big chunk out of a business bottom line, right? It also will mean, right, that the competitors are going to start paying great attention, right? So basically, it's both deterrence, right? You push other companies and being very careful, but it also pushes them into compliance. So one thing that we're very much selling, and we're going around the world, actually teaching compliance, not only to companies that have been in trouble before, but ideally, we're trying to reach now all the companies that are receiving contracts financed by the World Bank, and then by definition, might as well, open it up to as many companies as possible. And what we're trying to do there also links it to what the World Bank is trying to do right now, and that is financing for development, so the cascade. The point is that there's not enough money in development. Everybody knows that there's not enough money that could possibly be lent to get everybody up to the middle class, right? Which is what everybody wants. So you need to attract private sector money. Now, a lot of private sector companies are saying, well, we don't want to go do business in country X or Y because we think the corruption levels are too high, or we maybe our contracts are not going to get enforced, etc. So one thing which I see, which is very interesting, is that a country that starts getting a better reputation in terms of fighting corruption will attract much more private sector investment than other countries. And so this is something that we're trying to sell now, right? We're trying to say, so the other day I was speaking up in a meeting with all the vice presidents, and it was about attracting private sector development. And so I told Jim Kim, the president, I said, I think that the World Bank, we should try and sell anti-corruption, right, as a way to attract more, private sector development. Because also I laughed and I said that it's a good return on investment, right? That the bank's been putting a lot of money in anti-corruption, right? I think you can turn this into a negative, right? From the cop type, I see. So Frank is going like this, he's going to have a lot of comments on that one, right? Yeah. And I'm an optimist, obviously, because not only am I in development, but also in anti-corruption. But I do think we're onto something. I do think that you're starting to see a lot of changed behavior, right? So if you have a country, lately we've been asked, so just in the past couple of months, right? Training in China for state-owned enterprises that INT was delivering. Training in Vietnam for small and medium enterprises. We've been asked to help South Korea, training again of corporations. If you see that all these countries are actually going out of their way, right, to train their own corporations, you see that is so it's gotten a lot further, right, than so in terms of impact. I think this is a very good thing. It's gotten a lot further than just out with America and then just the OECD countries. You're seeing now that this is a concept that is taking root, and I like the fact that it's become a lot more normal as a subject. I think I'll stop there so that we have plenty of time for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascale. Do take a seat. As Frank mentioned in his kind introduction, I'm Charles Kenny. I'm a senior fellow here at CBD, previously at the World Bank, along with, oh gosh, everybody on the panel.
Oops.
Sorry about that. But now we're from diverse, if not from diverse backgrounds, at least from diverse presence. And so let me introduce Kathrin Frauscher, who's Deputy and Programme Director at the Open Contracting Partnership, and Hasan Tuluy is Board Director for Partnership for Transparency and a former Vice President. at the World Bank. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, Frank, a long-time friend of CGD. I was fascinated in particular by one line of your introductory remarks that Pascale is the World Bank equivalent of FBI Director Robert Mueller. I really want to know what your next job is going to be. Don't answer that. Well, I mean, sorry. Kathrin, so we've heard about what the bank is doing to reach out sort of beyond its immediate suppliers, or at least suppliers on contracts, and that seems to me a great way, as Pascale was mentioning, of sort of delivering on the cascade, if you will. Can you talk a bit about what you think the role of transparency is for the bank, and how much it could be doing there, or more it could be doing there, and sort of beyond that?
Sure, and thanks for having me, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces in the room as well. So for us, that's kind of a no-brainer. We feel that the World Bank could do much more in the terms of open contracting, and let me tell you why and how. I guess for all of you here, it won't be a surprise that procurement is the government #1 corruption risk. Pascale already mentioned the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, and 57% of the cases that get prosecuted under the convention are or have to do with procurement. It's also a huge market. It's $9.5 trillion, or every third dollar that a government spends goes through the procurement process. So there's a real risk that this money happens to that development happens the wrong way, the pictures that we saw. But also, as Pascale described, that business and markets get hurt. In Ukraine, we know that before they introduced their recent procurement and open contracting reforms, a third of their procurement budget was lost. And that means, many companies never enter the market. And Frank just gave me this nice term that then means an informal sector, right? That is much bigger and less efficient. So there are many reasons why we want to have procurement that's efficient and transparent and not corrupt, because it's the bricks and mortar of public benefit, right? It delivers life quality for all of us, but also functioning market economies. We feel that open contracting is one way, and an important way of helping to achieve that. For us, open contracting means three things. It's the disclosure of contracting information. It's the releasing of this information, of this data, in a user-friendly way, so that companies, government agencies, and people can actually use it. And then very important, and that's why I'm glad that I'm sitting next to someone from the Partnership for Transparency Fund, it's about the engagement and the capacity building, right? Transparency by itself does change very little. It's good, but nothing might happen, right? Making sure then that we have people and organizations that can use the data and analyze it is really important. And as in terms of anti-corruption in procurement, there are great tools out there now for red flags, flagging that there is a corruption risk so that you can prevent it before it happens, right? Because ideally, we don't go to a school and see the textbooks have not been delivered, but we prevent that we even get to that stage. And having a procurement system that's more open and accountable, more efficient, is a way of getting there. So we really would like to see that the bank, in its own contracting processes and in its client countries, does more around that.
Thanks. And Hasan, Kathrin sort of teed up nicely the question I was going to ask you, which is, it's great having the transparency, but you also need the sort of civil society to deliver on that. And I guess that comes to the question of the very title of the event about global systemic impact. I mean, is the bank having a systemic impact in that it is not only sort of delivering some of the way, not all of the way on transparency, but actually making civil society countries better able to deal with this problem?
Yeah, again, thank you all for inviting me. Really big subject and very important subject. I mean, as I was reflecting on the question of what is systemic, at the end of the day, to me, systemic is where it has a positive development outcome on the people's lives. Mm-hmm. It isn't just an accounting entry issue. The accounting entry, the fiduciary responsibility we all have is a step, but at the end of the day, it has to make people's life better. If there is no health, no education, no water supply, no sanitation, it just simply won't work. So number one, systemic to me is it makes a difference. Second, it has to make a difference that is sustainable, that it is less likely to regress. So it's not a one-off. You don't just do a single transaction that makes certain people feel good that we've gotten something, we tick the box and move on. We have to create essentially a corporate culture, an institutional culture, an ethical culture that allows us to progress. And I honestly don't believe it's a sort of binary world. There is the good and the bad. It's how do we make progress on certain areas. And I mean, in that regard, let me also step back, and I think having been at the institution, at the bank for a number of years, I think it's also critically important that the bank and OECD and a number of organizations, multilaterals, put this on the global agenda. They did the basic analytics. I don't think it would have gotten the play if it hadn't been for these large multilaterals and OECD and the like, prompted, of course, by the CSOs. So let's not forget, it was that collaboration. Now, I think Pascale teed up a number of issues, and I think it's important. I mean, one, I think the moving away from just a transactional project approach is going to be key. And I say that for a number of reasons. One, if you look at just the projects that we, the international community, finance, it's a small drop in the bucket. I mean, the GER, the Global Education Review, just I looked at it fairly recently, 60% or so of the funding, on average, comes from government, local and national. 30%, más o menos, comes from households. So depending on whether you're low income or middle income, it's between 2 and 15% that comes from donors. So unless we take the view that what we're doing is a demonstration effect, and it is building capacity to deepen that, we're, and I'm not a cynic to say shareholder value is better than local money, but I do think it's important that we sort of take the total picture, number one. And I think that is more the systemic approach. And I'll come to the question why I think civil society and local participation is so critical. The second one, so one is the population has to feel that they are engaged. It's not just somebody else's money. It's we, this is our input, this is our contribution. The second one I think is we should probably touch on separately, but we need to move away from projects because projects invariably focus you on a transaction, and there's massive grant corruption that's taking place that is not project financed and traceable through a project. Trade, I mean, you look at Odebrecht, you look at Ben Ali's Tunisia, these are not financed by projects directly, but money is fungible in that behavior. So when I think about where do we want to shift our effort, you know, maybe we want to shift somewhat over there. And the second one is, as you are pointing, and in other areas, more risk-based in what we do locally. I mean, you know, whether it's on the infrastructure procurement issues, looking at a risk-based approach so we can actually control it. Third, focusing on prevention. At the end of the day, our procurement colleagues, they're terrific, but it really starts with, are we speccing the project right? Are we, you know, can I get away with a 2-lane road instead of a 4-lane road with a government guarantee? And then we have the price, and then we have the quality and the delivery time. And you need a very different type of skill to do that. Now, that's all good, but that's the supply side to a large extent. I do believe fundamentally we must have demand, and we need to support the demand of communities. At the end of the day, most of the development is local. Garbage is collected locally, schools are local. Those pictures are all local. And somehow we need to translate our efforts into betterment, and therefore supporting the development of local communities to be able to constructively engage in this conversation with local authorities, having civil society organizations that allow local communities to network and reach out to local and national authorities, providing them the support training materials. I think those are the types of things that are absolutely essential. And I, you know, PTF, not to put a plug for PTF, of course, we've seen it. I mean, the Philippines example, how very small amounts of resources have had fundamental impact and tangible results. If we don't have that balanced approach with things that come from the top down, that are institutional, structural, and we don't have things coming from the bottom, which are where the demand is for better ethical, compliant behavior on the part of the authorities, and a partnership that really engages the local society, I think we'll continue to run after the problem as opposed to getting ahead of it.
Pascale, I was going to ask a different question, but actually what I'm going to do is turn those two polite interventions into something a bit more pointed and aimed at you, pardon me. So Kathrin says, the bank could be doing more on transparency. I mean, for example, to take a random example, it could be using the open contracting data standard, or at least pushing client countries to use it, and it's not. Why not? It could be, to take some of Hasan's points, you were talking about moving beyond the project and nodding along as Hasan was saying that. But still, if you look at where most bank staff sit who work on anti-corruption writ large, it probably is in procurement. It probably is sort of at project level interventions, not at this sort of broader level. What's going on there? And when it comes to the engagement of communities, the bank in its country work sometimes does work with CSOs, but frankly it's pretty limited, and mostly it doesn't. Is that because the bank can't do it, or is it because the bank isn't trying hard enough?
Okay. At the risk of being a lawyer, I'm going to say it depends, right?
Yeah, there we go.
That's how I'm going to say. Sorry,
that was too many
No,
questions.
thank you. No, you'll have to remind me of the different subparts. But first of all,
You can answer what you want.
I
Like a
would,
true lawyer.
Yeah, like a true lawyer. But I would first want to say that I'm a huge fan personally of anything which is open contracting and open government, as you and I had discussed, and same thing for demand for good governance, right? One of the reasons why I love. I mean, I should first also tell you why I got interested in anti-corruption and anti-fraud. And I see my former boss sitting there, Elizabeth Adu, when I was an operational lawyer at the World Bank working on Africa, and so I would go with my internal clients, and we would scope out a project, right? And then, or I would help them scope out a project, analyze if there were any issues, draft a loan agreement, negotiate the loan agreement, and if ever there was any problem, like, if you're an operational lawyer, you're the Office of Difficult Affairs, right? Every time it comes to you. The reason why I got involved in anti-corruption was that when I would sometimes see particular situations, I thought, well, what a waste of energy, right? How come, this is so sad that, we're not reaching, particular outcomes. And so, to your point on the demand for good governance, it is extremely important to I think the demand is there, right? I mean, people aren't stupid, okay? I mean, like I have always found that a very good way to sort of gauge what is going on is you take local cabs, right? And the local cab driver would invariably say, and not in an admiring way, la maison de la maîtresse du président, the house of the mistress of the president, la maison de la sœur du président, the house of the sister of, the president. And again, not in like, oh, good for them, okay? There was serious disdain in their voices, right? The local population, they know it, they see it, and it's not like they like it, right? But if you don't know how to in a respectful and an okay way, right, raise your issues, right, then nothing much is going to happen. So I find that, helping the local population, first of all, to know what it is that they're supposed to get is great, right? And open government, I think, helps with that, and open contracting helps with that. As the head of an investigative agency, I love anything which is open, right? Because then that's more data that we can analyze, right? And there you also get a much bigger impact. So, because everything, I mean, like I am so keenly aware, right, that at the World Bank, in the Integrity Vice Presidency, we're hovering between 87 staff, plus some consultants. Usually we're about 120, with a budget of $20 million, right? $21 million. So if we're only focusing on doing these few cases a year, right? Then we're again completely missing the opportunity. So we're really trying that every single thing that we do, we're trying make sure how can we have a bigger impact. So In INT, we work on, so the core business is still, the original business is investigative fraud and corruption in the World Bank finance contract. That's what we have jurisdiction over, right? And then since 10 years, we do a lot of prevention, looking at what went wrong, right, in those projects where, we received an allegation that we investigated, and then package these lessons learned in a way that you can share not only with people in the bank, right, but also through the governance global practice to the countries. And then the last thing, which I already mentioned, is this compliance element where we try and work with the corporations that were the bar to put in place, a good compliance program. And then again, using that experience, right? By now, we've been doing this for 6 years. So by now we have pretty good experience on how to set up compliance programs in countries where heretofore the word compliance program was not exactly a notion, right? And by the way, I'm also talking my home country, Belgium. So it was about 7 years ago, my sister, who's a lawyer in Brussels, calls me and she says, hey, FCPA, from crop practicing. Have you heard about that? And I said, yeah, that's what actually, we're all, compliance programs, right? So like, okay, it's arrived in Belgium, we're like, things maybe are going to improve going forward. But so to open contracting, right? We can continue to just look at our contracts, right, that we're financing, which, by the way, we will continue to do because, from a fiduciary point of view, we had better make sure that our own money that we receive is better used. But if we're working with the countries that are interested, right, and there are many countries now interested, when all the contracts are available, right, you can see so much. And so this is one of the things that, we're now trying to do much more data analysis and working with countries to do data analysis. And actually, we're going to looking into a couple of, pilot projects. If you're looking at not only the contracts, the companies that won contracts, but also the companies that lost the contracts, you can see very clear collusion patterns, right? But what you can also see, and this brings it back, to developmental impact, are the prices too high, right? So in government procurement, for instance, at the World Bank, there is a big push now with the new procurement framework to become a lot more aware of what the market really, what's normal in the market and what's not, right? And so that, from a prevention point of view, whenever we speak, for instance, to government, to procurement people at the bank, but especially, and much more importantly, to project implementation unit people, to train them to say, like, look, if it looks funny, it probably is funny, right? Do you know the unit price, right? Like we've seen some contracts where, it was 90% above the price. There's something wrong here, right? So the more that PIU officials know about, what things are supposed to cost, right? It may sound like a silly thing, but that is extremely powerful, right? Is that, and in the past, that wouldn't have not been strictly enforcement and therefore maybe of less interest. But to us these days, I think, the conversation has grown that, you try and education is very important, right? And so both at the local level, right? And then at the level of the open contracting. The thing that I like about anti-corruption in general is that it's so multidisciplinary, right? You need really everybody working together at all the levels, at all the different disciplines. I'm sure I forgot a piece of your so far. Okay, yeah, okay.
I was very interested. But sorry, please.
No, I was just going to say one thing. I don't disagree with the direction of travel, and I don't want to put this as an either or. You need both. I just wonder whether we got the balance right. In an organization, at least by the time I left, the internal resourcing was always done around projects. The bulk of the resourcing is done around projects. So it is invariably, it requires a certain type of skill, and it takes you away, even though it's actually, compared to the broader envelope, chicken feed. Yeah? The kind of long-term support you need to give to community is really small. But it is not there. So that long-term engagement with a community, with a local authority, because many of these things I think it's a little more complicated, at least at the local service delivery side. I was just at a discussion with a Colombian friend of mine, and we were discussing about the organizational and corporate culture aspects. And there's there's ethics, integrity, compliance that is part of a value set and norms, which are not identical with corruption, collusion, and fraud. And unless you have a constructive engagement where the local community that really wants to have education, wants to have water, wants to have these things, they can identify where there are inefficiencies and wastage, which are not necessarily corruption, okay? And we don't know the order of magnitude of those things. It could be 50-50 for all I know. And therefore, we may be misallocating our resources. My point is that it's the direction I'm comfortable with. I think we're missing an opportunity by not finding resources somewhere in the system to have a long-term commitment and engagement to build up that local demand. Not that the foreigners do it, but we enable by creating a sense of citizen engagement, CSO capacity, knowledge, networking, giving them the tools, and the media to shine a spotlight so that conversation can move forward. I mean, that's my fundamental point. It's not I'm not saying get rid of the compliance monitoring part, but it's insufficient if we're going to solve the development problem.
I want to build on that point and ask all of you. Pascale, you mentioned that the cascade, and sort of the SDG environment of we need trillions, not billions, and how do we get from the billions to trillions? Well, for the sort of, for the financing side of that, we'll probably never make it to the trillions, but we kind of know what tools, and we have some of them lying around, would achieve that. So you make the IFC bigger, you do more MEGA, you do more project preparation funds. There are sort of all of these bits of the World Bank Group that already exist. That maybe if you scale them enough, you get to trillions. You don't really see quite the same thing when it comes to sort of anti-corruption from the billions to the trillions. So the bank playing a huge role in non-bank projects, non-bank investments in fighting anti-corruption. And
that's a governance global practice, right?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And it's again sort of a reasonably small part of the institution as a whole. And is that because actually the World Bank, for all the myriad wonderful things it can do, is actually not terribly well placed to do the trillions anti-corruption work, if you will? Because although we're now allowed to talk about corruption, politics is still a tough area for the World Bank, and corruption is deeply political. The bank still, first and foremost, its clients are governments, and that's not always the most easy way into the anti-corruption issue. I mean, are we asking too much of the institution to say it should take on this sort of systemic stuff?
That's for me, the question.
With anybody on the...
No, go for it. I mean, should we hear from Pascale?
On that one, I tend to be very practical, right? And so I like to look at things from a practical and an efficient point of view. Right. So you start with the ones that want to play with you, right? And so there's no point, right? I mean, our member countries are sovereign nations, right? There's no point trying to push, when you're dealing with the wrong actors, right? I very much believe in being very strategic. And so, for instance, working with particular countries where you know that they, in their region, have a big impact, right? Or have, have a good influence. So, for instance, to me, training state-owned enterprises in China was very interesting because, not only do they do business, all over the world, but to the extent it's very, very interesting, right? I often say this, that, anti-corruption to me is not a moral thing, right? I mean, there is a moral element to it, right? But at the end of the day, if you're looking at what happens, right, it's money, right? It's corporations, right? It's big vested interests. So if some people are clean because they choose to be clean, right? If a corporation is clean, or a country is clean because it chooses to be clean, right? Or it's forced to be clean because of enforcement, right? Enforcement is, I'm still on the enforcement side. I still think enforcement is a very good thing, right? You just need to leverage it more. It will want the others to do the same thing. And it's a beautiful thing that you see, right? So recently the barred companies usually are on the speaking tour, right? They get invited, they sit at panels like us, right? And they will be selling the fact that they're very clean now. Why? Because they're telling their competitors, you better watch it, we're looking at you, right? Same is happening with countries, right? Countries that want to really do something in the fight against corruption for a variety of reasons. Some countries do it because of reputation. Others do it because they want to attract more private sector development. For me, I don't care why they're doing it, right? But if so, for a unit like INT, and also for the governance global practice, because we work very much hand in hand on those issues. You start with the countries that are interested, right? And you, by all means, you want to engage with countries that locally, right, in their region, will have a sphere of influence. So, for instance, Byung Kook, who's one of my, Korean prosecutor, one of my colleagues in INT, yesterday he visited us with, a Korean delegation, and we spoke about that. Like if Korea starts training its own corporations, right, and then it's all corporations, not just corporations that get, World Bank Finance contracts. That is bound to have an influence, right? In these countries, regional countries, where Korea has its influence. So it's all about catapulting in a way, like and maximizing. But at the end of the day, you must, a country must be wanting to play with you, right? Yeah. So to a certain extent, right? No, and can I just say, to a certain extent, the reason why I said to a certain extent is that the World Bank also tried different things, right? So when it moved from, and you see this very much in national context. You go from nothing, and then you start, and you sort of overreact, right? And then it sort of gets a balance, right? So at the World Bank at one point, I think for very good intentions, it was, well, let's stop disbursements on projects, right? That is a way of doing things, but in a way you use your leverage when you do that, right? When you just stop disbursement all along. So I find that it's better to try, like if there's a corruption issue in a particular country, you speak about it openly, you do something about it openly, and I always tell donors, don't freak out. I mean, like, where do you think we're working, right? I mean, we're all working, right, in very difficult environments. When there's an issue, let's deal with it. And let's deal with it, using the procurement people, the financial management people, the legal people, and also, enforcement on the side of, the NGOs, right? And so, it really is it's a team effort. Right?
Yeah, I mean, my comment, I guess, was, and Pascale and I have worked, including as she was my lawyer at some point in West Africa. So, it is more whether we're missing emphasis as the landscape is shifting, and the landscape is maturing. So it's not a good or bad question. It's really, with scarce resources, are we really moving sufficiently robustly in the direction where, at least in my biased view, they should be?
What would you do?
One is I'll tell you. I mean, one I think one area is that when we are too project and transaction oriented, we're missing some of the grand corruption issue. Mm-hmm. I mean, Jose Feigenbaum, a colleague from ex-IMF, had written a fabulously interesting paper about illicit financial transfers out of Africa. And he finds, again, better approximately right than precisely wrong, he says between 4 and 7% of GDP. That is anywhere between 2 to 3 times ODA. So I can imagine a country that gets investments. I can think of Tunisia, for example, at one point, used to get a lot of investment. Brazil got a lot of investment, but Odebrecht and then Ben Ali's capture of those things we just don't deal with, okay? We just don't deal perhaps with enough force as we do deal with the projects and programs we finance. So, I mean, one thing I would suggest is that in the governance practice in the country and so on and so forth, we take a slightly broader view, That's, I think, point number one. Number two, I think moving in the preventive, I think, is an excellent idea, because you want to catch this thing before it happens. Something will still happen, but the more you catch it at the design stage, at the concept stage, which requires a very different set of skills and knowledge, the engineers, is this in fact the right thing? Is this spec the right way? Is it the right quality? Is the right timing? And so on and so forth. And rather than the control setting, which is necessary, but it's a different set of skills. And the third thing is, other things, but I mean, let me just touch on these three. While it's true the bank has never been a great retail institution, we've been a wholesale institution more than a retail institution. Whether it's the bank or any other organization, stand up a facility that gives a predictable stream of funding to support the local communities, to develop that capacity. Because there will never, ever be enough money in the international donor community to chase after every project and every school and every water pipe. Okay, we catch some, and I would flip that around then, and then the international community does a much more risk-based approach, and you know, you can use technology, you can do other things and go after them. So it's not an either or. I just think that on balance, I would shift resources in a couple of other areas more forcefully than perhaps has happened so far.
Yeah, we might be a very boring panel. There's very little to disagree with, right? I mean, how can you be against systematic change or prevention? So yes, I mean, yes and amen to everything that Pascale and Hasan just said. And maybe just to highlight, I mean, but I think also Charles hit a point there that some things maybe the bank is not best place to do, right? I mean, I think what you said before, making the business case for more anti-corruption and also how you engage companies, right? I mean, that was one of the reasons why the Open Contracting Partnership was actually started at the bank, but then we moved out of the bank, right? Because maybe the bank is not the best place to do some of those things, including maybe working with local communities. However, like I said before, we do think the bank can definitely do more. So I guess hopefully everyone would listen to Pascale. We have seen examples in Ukraine, I think, where, not to say that there is no brand corruption happening anymore, but they were able to have a systematic change and quite a tremendous change from the way, you know, they were engaging businesses, they were engaging civil societies, the way they did procurement and contracting, to now, you know, having, you know, 3 times the level of corruption, 3 times the level of corruption, 3 times the level of competition, and corruption has been halved, right? And some amazing developments and stories to tell from there. And sadly to say, the World Bank didn't do anything there, right? Yeah. And it was EBRD and other forces, Partnership for Transparency Fund, that's wording there.
PTF doing civil society support.
Who were able to make that shift, you know.
I have more things I want to ask, but I'm going to hold off because we have an audience full of incredibly knowledgeable people. So stick a hand up. I've got one over here, and then I'll come over here. And then I'll come over there.
Hi, I'm Miguel Schloss. I'm from Chile. I agree with everything that was said, and even the things that weren't said. And my broad question is, when you step a little bit back, do you think that we are winning this race, that we are making real progress? I don't mean in terms of seeing that the things that we are advocating are being done, but rather that, in fact, corruption is being reduced and we will no longer be needed. I mean it seriously. There are many things that happen way beyond the radar of the World Bank. I've dealt with extractive industries. I've dealt with all kinds of things, and believe me, they are capable of doing things that you can't even imagine, that no auditor can even track. And the question, the fundamental question is whether institutions like the World Bank and others have the dexterity, the flexibility, the imagination, such that they are ahead of those parties in the private sector, etc., which are way, way more flexible and faster. What are we doing, if anything, that can deal with this issue really, really preventively in such a way that fighting corruption doesn't become an eternal work in progress, but rather something that we will resolve?
Do you think we can answer the question as to whether we're winning?
Can I start with it? So several years ago, I was speaking at a conference it was in Germany, and like 9 years ago. So in Germany also there was not much happening yet, you know. So it was just starting, and I was sitting next to U.S. prosecutors, and one of them put a slide on the screen, and I'll never forget it because it very much shows, you know, what we're up against, and it showed like a cart and a horse, and then, you know, a bigger car and a bigger car and a bigger car, and then a Maserati, okay? And the Department of Justice guy said, okay, the bad guys is a Maserati, right? And if we're lucky, we're sort of a small car, right? Because that's the reality, right? And the way that you're saying is that, you know, each time that we uncover a particular scheme, right? well, what do you think? Bad guys in the business of doing bad things, right? So they're very good at it. So they will find out, a new scheme, which is why I love so much what it is that you're doing, because it's only when you have all the data that is open, right, that then us, who trying to do good things, right, and you make it open, and also I like very much, this idea that you make it open in such a sense that it can actually be used, right? I will never forget in this regard Sanjay Pradhan when he showed a picture of archives in some country, I never want to mention countries, okay, being very diplomatic, but it was some country somewhere, and where the country had decided, okay, let me make all the archives, available. You've seen that mess, okay? So you could go in, but there was no way you could have ever found, that information that you needed. So to your question, people will always, right? People that are in the business of, doing bad things, right? They're very clever at what they're doing, right? And it is upon us, right? To try and always stay up with, what they're doing. I find that technology is something that, without exaggerating its, usefulness. Us working on anti-corruption and anti-fraud, because it's as important. We have to continue try and catch up. So are we? I try and think that it's a good idea to be very humble about what we do, right? So are we winning? No. Are we making huge progress? Yes. Right? Is it imperative that all of us continue? Yes. Also because you need to at the local level too. You need to continue to give people, hope, make it so that, that, and tell people that, if you make, small changes or, you speak up in, particular ways, change will happen, right? For all of us working on anti-corruption, I think the last thing that we should do is be very defeatist, because, who's going to follow us if we're, So if we're constantly spreading I don't think, it's going to work, because, I'm often asked this, is it really worth it? And I'm like, okay, we'll flip it around. What would happen if we didn't do what we're doing, right? And so one can look at it from both, ways. Yeah.
There was somebody back there. Yeah.
Hi, Charles. We know each other from
Good God.
previous times. I'm Donald O'Leary. I have a comment and a question. My comment is that when we look at corruption, we want to deal with it, we need to work both at the project level and at the more macro level. If you think about the involvement of local communities in reducing corruption, how are they going to go about it? As Pascale's first slide shows, they will be working on specific projects, schools, electricity supply, water supply. My question is the following. I represent Transparency International on the steering committee of the OECD's Water Governance Initiative. And one of the major lessons there is that in attacking corruption, it has to be involving everybody, not just the private sector, not just local communities, but also in the water sector, we're talking about, for example, water utilities. And my question for the panel is, when we are dealing with corrupt practices in the private sector, what about the water utility? No contract is signed unless two people or two entities are involved. So what steps are being taken so that the utilities who are tolerating corruption in the private sector, what can be done so that they can take a more active role in reducing corruption?
Yeah,
Everybody looking at
everyone looking at me. Yeah. So no particular examples on water utilities specifically, but I guess we have seen thinking about other utilities in Romania, for example. We were working with the electricity utility company there, and they wanted to change the game, right? They wanted to work more on an open procurement process, and I think a good clarification is that we really, when we think about open contracting, we think about it from the planning all the way through implementation. Correct. So it's not just about the awarding stage of when a contract is awarded. And I guess it begins, with a utility either having so much pressure on it from the outside that they want to change, or having someone on the inside that wants to change. And I think going back to the business incentive, it can make, depending the country that you're in and how the economy around there works, it can make business sense, right, to change that, because you can see wins for the companies that then can go for new contracts and new opportunities, or can get better prices, or see internal efficiencies. That's one of the ones that we now see much more often pursued, that it goes hand in hand with anti-corruption, right? I think one thing is also, it's not often just about anti-corruption, but if you improve the efficiencies, you also get some anti-corruption, or the other way around. So I think it's important to think about that across those benefits.
Can I just follow up, if you will, on that question? That one of the things that I've found fascinating from reading the sort of the summaries of lessons learned from INT is how often collusion and corruption go together. That either the government official or utility official is actually taking the lead in organising a collusive arrangement, or at least being a willing participant and taking their cut when they see a collusive arrangement occurring. The other thing that used to be true, and maybe not as true anymore, that was interesting about World Bank debarment procedures, is a lot of firms were debarred where there had been evidence of collusion that was facilitated by corruption, and you didn't see anybody being sacked from the government side. Mm-hmm. Is that still the case? And is that just, that's the way it is? The bank can debar firms, it can't sack government officials.
True.
Right.
So it depends, again, at the risk of sounding like a former lawyer. So the bank has jurisdiction, right? True and not true. Again, it depends, right? The bank, as far as the sanction system itself is concerned, so we only have jurisdiction over companies and individuals who have received a contract financed by the World Bank, right? That doesn't mean, right, that we don't try and use again in terms of leverage, right? The fact that there was a debarment against a particular company to also go to the government. So every single debarment case leads to a referral, and the referral goes to the governments that were involved. So if it's a Belgian company who did something, say where were we working together? Burkina Faso, right? Then a referral report will go to Burkina Faso saying, look what your government officials were doing,
She's
right?
only illustrating it didn't happen. Yeah.
Never happened, yeah. Actually, I can't remember. And then a referral report will go to the Belgians to say, look what your Belgian company, is doing, or it could be and so then that then allows, right, the governments involved to do something against, their own government officials. There again, I have to say that obviously you're dealing with sovereign nations, right? And that the uptake will be more or less enthusiastic depending on the country. And there again, I have to be very optimistic, because if you see trends, if you see what happened, 10 years ago, and even since a couple of years, that mentality is very much changing, right? Yeah. Because and I'm looking at, again, I don't want to pick on Korea, but I think it's a very good example, right? If a country like Korea is enforcing, right, then other countries might say, well, I guess maybe we should do the same thing, right? Because there's a political element that you can also turn it in good thing. It's once the cat's out of, I always like to say cat's out of the bag, but once the cat's out of the bag in this area, governments too, I think, will want to be seen, and we see this very much. They will want to be seen as, not rogue nations, but countries, proper countries, they want to do something about it. Is everything going to happen overnight? No. Is it a couple of steps forward and then, backwards? Yeah. But if you compare what happens, now to what will happen 20 years ago, I think, we can say that, progress is being made with that.
I mean, I tend to be the eternal optimist, Miguel. Things can get better, and I think if you sort of look at the broader development picture, things have gotten better. I mean, despite some of the institutional problems. So the question is, could it have gotten even better if we had dealt with some of these issues more proactively and more rigorously? Because you can then redeploy resources to something more effective and more productive. I think, so yes, we've made progress, but there's a certain entropy to things. You know, things improve and then they slide back. So the question is, how do we keep raising the bar? And, you know, just take an example again of the Philippines case that I mentioned in the work that PTF did. I mean, you can actually track it. The number of districts that had only 40% of the school textbooks eventually got 100%.
That's great.
If you look at the quality of the books, instead of lasting only 2 years, they last 5 years. You can trace those things. And that happened, why? Because community, again, it was over 10 years. It was, you know, I think on the order of $50,000 a year. Not a lot of money, but you got people engaged. What that then does is I think the community expects an outcome level that is higher than before. And then you need to keep feeding that to make sure that you take it to the next level up. And if you sort of step out, then things may regress, new government comes in, new change in local authority. So I think the thing is, how do we get a continuous stream going to continue raise what is the baseline expectation, right? So I mean, I think
from
that's
a World Bank
doable.
point of view, how would you do that? I mean, like, you know, if you come and you sit with the, you know, your former colleagues, and they're designing, you know, because I mean, you either design, you know, brick and mortar projects, right? You know, like investment projects, or you have development policy lending. So you would tell them what?
I would. I mean, first of all, I think
Next project,
when
do
you put things together, the staff skills you need are different. Okay, so I mean, for example, to the point about water utilities, whenever I've some friends who work in PPPs and sort of water management contracts and other things. It starts with having real deep knowledge about how do you construct a contract, I mean, in the first place. And I'm not sure we necessarily have that. And then making sure that it's not just a price issue, there's a quality issue, there's a delivery issue, that you monitor it. You know, there's a lot of stuff, because I think, you know, I think I alluded it earlier, what is the right balance? And it's probably very contextual between the sort of ethics, integrity, compliance, and that leads to inefficiency. What's the culture of inefficiency? And what is truly fraud, corruption, and collusion? My guess is that if you have fraud, collusion, and corruption, and a government revenue guarantee, you're probably breeding an environment where inefficiency is going to be very high, just because who gives the you know what? You know, it's just not a particularly propitious one. I'm not sure it necessarily drives the other way around. So it is, I would separate the policy and regulatory work and have that, make sure that you sequence it right. Okay? Don't combine it with the project. By then it's too late. But then you're dispersing and you're going to get a waiver. I would also separate completely and whether it's a fund that is stood up by the bank or some other institution, support to the kind of local communities that is not just for the community activists, but also for the local authorities, the local department that is in charge of water, sanitation, and whatnot. In many ways, the real face of democracy is local. I mean, that's where it's going to happen. And if you can give them tangible content to say, things are improving, then you can actually move the bar, yeah? And you just got to keep it. But I would keep those, coordinate them, but keep them separate, because
like
otherwise the
sequencing,
pressure
yeah.
is going to be to disperse, and that's a different group of people than the people who
So
are.
just one note, you were doing nothing for my attempt to say that there was a diverse panel, despite the fact we're all ex-World Bank or current World Bank, by saying we when you refer to the World Bank. But anyway, old
They still
habits,
pay my pension.
Old habits die hard. Sorry.
Thank you very much. There are two members of your panel who worked with me in some very critical situations in Africa. Hasan, when I started the first health project in Guinea, and Pascale, when she was my lawyer for the Burkina Faso HIV/AIDS program that I was
I
managing.
feel like everybody's lawyer here by the time.
And
we're
I
done,
was
right?
particularly very grateful to her, because the government had its tentacles right into the World Bank. And they were not interested in having NGOs involved in the program. Yet the reason why we went to Burkina Faso was because the NGOs had started a very impressive initiative on combating HIV/AIDS. And Hasan would remember that we had, looking at Secretary's program, they had centers around the country that we decided to convert into women's development centers and voted just $300,000 to support that. We got hammered a lot back in the bank because these are not legal institutions, these are not this and so on. Why I tell these two little anecdotes is that the bank has been in development business for more than 60 years. Our performance is not impressive because we started off assuming that development can only come from ideas from outside. And then when it was not working, we decided that, oh, let's get the communities, the governments involved. And then the bilaterals suddenly decided not to fund UNDP anymore, or even the World Bank, but to put up their own money as trust funds. And suddenly, we have these donors meddling up a lot with the policy issues that have been agreed, the development program issues that have been agreed with the bank. And I will not hesitate to cite these countries. Côte d'Ivoire, I would cite Cameroon. The bank disbursed millions to these countries, which never reached the countries. They all ended up in the French Central Bank. So I think we are not going to combat corruption until we agree that the agenda of different donors is not the same. Mm-hmm. I went to DRC on HIV/AIDS, and I confronted the donor agencies, the Belgian Development Fund, then the GTZ, British Development Assistance, and USAID. And I said, how can you be funding HIV/AIDS programs and then your agencies are in the country disbursing the money? Don't you see a conflict of interest? The Belgian guy told me, they are really NGOs. I said, what? Belgian Development Corporation, when did it become an NGO? So I think there is one, lack of courage among the very senior bank people to tackle the conflicting relationship that the bank has with its major donors. And secondly, we will never combat corruption without combating the small arms program, because democracy cannot advance in these countries unless the citizenry can get up and tell their politicians to go to hell. Last comment I want to make is that there have actually been some very scandalous cases. I worked at the bank with a gentleman on water. He went to Cameroon to privatize the water sector. I retired 2 years later, and I went to Cameroon and found him as the deputy CEO of an entity that came from Morocco to manage Cameroon's water. I don't think that was a mistake. It was corruption.
So the revolving door issue, I think, is an interesting one for you all to try and tackle. I must say, there is this sense that donors have come in with approaches that work and applied them or asked for them to be applied. And different donors have slightly different opinions on which ones, but all of them are fairly global. I mean, frankly, including things like open contracting. It's like, there is one data standard for the world. Correct me. Is this a case of sort of isomorphic mimicry, to use Pritchett's phrase, that we've got a kind of one-size-fits-all solution, or at least each donor has a slightly different one. But anyway, so are donors trying to trot out the same thing in a way that won't work?
Okay, on the donors, I've been seeing something interesting, and that is so. From the first days that I used to trek to Africa, and whenever I was in a country office, on occasion I would go to donor meetings. I thought it was very interesting that everybody was sort of trying to there were some attractive topics, and everybody wanted to seem to want to finance the same thing, and then it's a very good thing to coordinate. It is true, right, that if multilaterals are doing a particular thing, and that then bilateral lending, is doing something different in terms of what in the area, for instance, of auditing and just general fighting fraud and corruption. Maybe in the look again. I mean, let's not be naive. Are there differences? I'm sure still now. Is it changing? For sure. So one of my ex-colleagues, Bart Stevens, sits in the back. When he was with INT, he was in charge, and we've done it, this is the third time that it happened now, right? Was a roundtable of bilateral donors on auditing and anti-corruption. And so these are countries as well as some donor agencies, like USAID would show up, and then so you have the Danes and the Dutch and things like that, open for everybody. So if you hear about other bilateral donors who want to join, very welcome. What's interesting there is that I think it's a very good idea to put the sort of ethics, compliance / anti-corruption auditing, units of the bilateral donors together in one room. So, and at the World Bank, it's the investigators, but it's also the auditors, right? The donors, I think, are starting to understand this loud and clear as well, right? That if they're not following their own money, right, what is changing is the mentalities around the world are changing, right? The public opinion about corruption has changed tremendously, and so if you take a country like Denmark or the Netherlands, in those constituents bilaterally also want to make sure that the money is being followed, right? Not just for MDBs but also bilaterally, and so. I think that when I saw the crowd that showed up in DC last week, I thought that's an interesting development. Like again, 10 years ago, you would not have seen that. Is every country there? No. Is every country welcome? Yes. Right. So I think these are a sign of the times. That, I think because the moment it's again this with the cat out of the bag. The moment that some are doing it, others feel compelled for political reasons. Was fine with me, right? To do the same thing. The other day I was sitting with a bilateral donor and I was explaining what Integrity Vice Presidency does, and the minister was like, looking at his Director General. Are we doing similar things? We should do something like that. So you see, I mean, countries feel the pressure to do the same thing. So,
final words. Yeah. Sorry.
I mean, for me, just for open contracting, I think an interesting concept is that or actually also for anti-corruption, right? Corruption happens in the United States, it happens in the UK, it happens in France. So it's not just that this is a development, an issue for development countries that are developing. Neither is, corruption in procurement or how you can have a more open, efficient, and accountable procurement system. And we actually have seen now that there are strong and interesting functioning innovations coming from countries like Ukraine and Georgia, and they are now being brought to the UKs and the Frances of the world. And that's an interesting phenomenon to say, and it maybe speaks a bit to your point, right? That maybe some of the solutions that have to be localized, come from other places than, from the people, frankly, who are sitting here in this room and who are weird.
much that we are grateful to the people who are sitting
Yes.
in this room. And apologies, we have to close the formal session. I'm sure the panelists won't mind hanging around a little bit for further discussion. And apologies for not getting to you. But thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, for speaking.
Thank you, Charles.
And, do come again.